Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville politics, government, news, education, business, arts and entertainment. I don't know. Whatever gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com. Joined, as always, by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott?
I'm doing okay. I am getting more and more excited about the Big Ears Festival, which is coming up this weekend. So,
Big Ears Festival? Yeah. What's that? Sounds vaguely familiar.
You might want to just ask your wife about it.
Oh, is that the thing my wife works on? Well, yeah. We keep, because of my journalistic objectivity, of course, in our household, we keep a very strong division of, I don't want any conflicts of interest. So that's right. Big Ears Festival coming up. Looking forward to it. But we have a bunch of stuff to talk about before we get there. This week, as we mentioned last week on the podcast, this past week was spring break, and so sort of the formal civic calendar was quiet. There weren't a lot of meetings scheduled or anything, but there were still some interesting things that happened. Interesting news about a proposed commercial development just north of downtown, close to Old Gray Cemetery. Some action in the state legislature worth talking about. The City of Knoxville received a big, large, huge federal grant to address some historical injustices. We're going to talk about that. But Scott, I thought we would start out by talking a little bit more about the March 5th primary, which, of course, last week we talked about the results of that, who won, who lost, and so forth. This week we took a slightly deeper look, which we like to do after an election, and really kind of go precinct by precinct in a lot of the races and see if anything interesting stands out. And so, I thought one of the most significant things about this particular election was the turnout, but specifically it was who turned out. And we talked last week that it was a fairly low turnout race. We had about 60,000 votes. There are just under 300,000 registered voters in the county. So that was right around a 20% turnout. Not a lot of people. And it was also down by 28% from the 83,000 or so people who voted in the 2020 primary. So the same cycle 4 years earlier. So that's a pretty big fall off. And as we talked about last week, with this particular cycle, during the presidential election years, when the county primary is held in conjunction with the presidential primary in March, turnout is almost completely driven by the presidential primary. There are people, for sure, who come out to vote because they're interested in local races, but they are a minority of the people who show up. What mostly drives people out to this election every 4 years is what's going on in the presidential races. So if you compare it, the 2020 and 2024 races, the first obvious difference is that fewer people voted this year, but it gets even more stark when you look at the partisan divide in who voted. And so we did talk about last week that the majority of people who voted in this election pulled Republican ballots. Close to 80% of the people who voted pulled Republican ballots. And so that told you that, well, it was mostly Republicans who were voting and or people who might usually vote for Democrats but were crossing over because they cared about some particular Republican primary. But what's really interesting is that there were about 12,000 and some Democratic ballots pulled. If you compare those two numbers separately to 4 years previously, Republican turnout was actually up from 4 years ago. In 2020, when President Donald Trump was not facing any serious opposition in the primary, and also maybe some Republican voters had a little bit of Trump fatigue and were willing to vote for him in the fall, but weren't fired up enough to charge to vote for him in a more or less meaningless primary. Republican turnout was only about 35,000, whereas this year it was 47,000. So Republican, even though the overall turnout was down by 28%, Republican turnout actually went up by almost a third from 4 years prior. So what that tells you is that the Democratic turnout went way down. And interestingly, in 2020, there were actually more Democratic ballots cast in the Knox County primary than Republican ballots. There are about 46,000 or so, or 45,000. Which, first of all, that's unusual to have any election in Knox County where there are more Democratic voters than Republican voters, because there are overall more Republican voters than Democratic voters in the county. But what that means is that people pulling Democratic ballots went from 46,000 to 12,000. It fell by about 75%. That's just a tremendous drop-off. The drop-off was so huge that even though Republican turnout went up, the Democratic turnout fell so far that it pulled down the countywide turnout by 28%. Like, that's the scale of the difference. And of course, if you look at what was going on for Democrats in March of 2020, that was still a very competitive primary at that point, especially between now President Joe Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders. But you had other candidates in the mix there as well, pulling some people out. And so that's none of that is a surprise, but when you look at the numbers, it's a very stark illustration that every 4 years when we have this election, turnout is going to be almost entirely driven by what's going on in the presidential races. And that means that our local races, the county primaries that are like yoked to that presidential primary, are really just at the mercy of those sort of national political trends.
Yeah, the trend in voting didn't surprise me at all. The scale did. That was huge. But then again, you look. The Democrats there was no opposition to President Biden this year, and only one contested primary race locally, and it was in just the first district.
The first district, right?
And that was so only first district voters had a local choice. So it's not surprising that there was a fall off in Democratic votes, but 75% is huge.
Yeah, and Biden did not have any opposition on the ballot, but there was an uncommitted box you could check, and some progressive groups nationally have launched an effort to persuade Democratic or progressive voters to vote uncommitted in the primary to signal discontent with Biden's support for Israel in its incursion into Gaza. And we saw a little bit of that here. Basically, 11% of the people who did cast Democratic ballots in this primary voted uncommitted. The other 89% voted for Biden. So, a little bit of a show of protest, but not a big one. And on the Republican side, somewhat similar in the sense that, and of course, because there was at least technically contested primary on the Republican side, I think that accounted for not just Republicans coming out, but actually coming out in greater numbers than there was 4 years prior. And there was an option for Republicans who are tired of Trump, and there is a segment of the Republican Party for sure that's tired of Trump, just as there's a segment of the Democratic Party that's tired of Biden. And they had an option to vote for Nikki Haley, former South Carolina governor, and about 27% of the votes in the Knox County primary went for Haley. So some, as with people voting uncommitted on the Democratic side, some show of dissatisfaction with the presumptive nominee, but not an overwhelming one, obviously. And in fact, Trump, it was interesting if you went back to 2016, when Trump ran the first time in the Republican primary, and there was still a contested primary at that point, Trump did win in Knox County in 2016, but he only got 32% of the vote. Yeah. Marco Rubio, if anybody remembers when Marco Rubio ran for president, Marco Rubio got 28% of the Knox County vote in 2016. You compare that to this year, where Trump got 68% of the Republican Party vote. Obviously, just another indication that Trump has essentially taken over the Republican Party at this point. But so anyway, that was like the big picture. That was the engine that drove the turnout we saw, or the lack of turnout that we saw. And then there were a couple of other interesting things in some of the local races. The property assessor's race, which we talked about last week, which of course was so close, decided by 12 votes countywide out of 42,000 votes cast in that race. And looking at that precinct by precinct, because one thing you might expect to see is that, maybe whichever areas of the county one candidate or the other candidate is from, they might do better there. And there was some variation, but really it was very close across the whole county. And in terms of winning individual precincts, Phil Ballard, who of course did win that race, he carried 53 out of the 100 precincts that had ballots in that race, and Jackie Raley, who was the other candidate, carried 45 of them, and then there were another couple where they tied. And so, even and it wasn't like, Raley won all the precincts in one part of the county and Ballard won all of them in another. They both won precincts in areas across the whole county. And so that just showed that was, the top line number that you saw there, that was true across the county. It was just a very, very close race. They both turned out their supporters in almost exactly equal numbers, across the county. So that was a case of, sometimes you go and you do this analysis, like looking for hidden meanings in the precinct numbers. And in this one, there really weren't any hidden meanings in the precinct numbers. It was just like, well, that was a really close election. The 5th District County Commission race was interesting. Again, just in terms of the scale, we talked about this last week. Angela Russell, the Republican who won that primary, was up against a field of 4 other candidates. So you had 5 Republicans running in that district, which covers Farragut and Concord. And Russell kind of surprised lots of people by winning 48% of the vote, which is a huge number for somebody in a, what looked to be a fairly contested 5-way race. She got more than twice as many votes as Tony Scott, who finished second. Looking at the precinct numbers really just emphasized, and there was some talk about, well, of course, Russell was going to have support in the Choteau area because she was part of community groups down there that had gotten organized to fight against an affordable housing complex there and so forth. But she won almost the entire district. She won 8 out of 9 precincts, and Tony Scott, the second place finisher, only won 1 precinct, which is the precinct that she herself lives in, and she barely won it. Russell finished a very close second there. So that just showed that Russell clearly ran a very effective campaign across the whole district, and she won across the whole district. And a similar pattern showed up in the 9th District, where Andy Fox defeated Barry Neal, and Fox won by somewhat larger margins in some areas, but again, he won across basically all of South Knoxville and South Knox County. So, I think that in both of those cases, and we talked about this last week, those are both candidates who worked with Eric Wider, local conservative consultant, and they look like they took a pretty strategic approach to really dominating in those districts.
Yeah, the South race especially was that was actually somewhat surprising. Was Fox's just domination.
Yeah, he won like 70% of the vote overall in the district. And Barry Neal, the other Republican candidate who was endorsed by Carson Daly, the current commissioner down there, he didn't even win his home precinct. I mean, you might have thought that Neal, who lives in South Haven, is very active in that neighborhood association, that he might have performed better in that neighborhood and in Island Homes, some of those neighborhoods closer in, some of the city precincts. And that was true to some degree, but only to a degree because Fox still won everywhere. So that was interesting. The one other local race I wanted to mention was the 8th District County Commission race, which was a three-way race on the Republican side between DJ Corcoran, Cara Daly, and Adam Thompson. As we talked about last week, Thompson won that narrowly. He won 40% of the vote. Corcoran won 38%, and then Cara Daly won the other 22%. And of course, in a three-way race, it gets hard to, like if you imagine that as a two-person race between Thompson and Corcoran, where would Cara Daly's voters have gone? There's just no way to know. We don't have a good handle on that. You can assume that it had an effect because the overall outcome between the top two was pretty close. But what was interesting there was that Corcoran, who is came into that race pretty well known as former spokesman for the Knoxville Fire Department, plus also his sister, Sherry Witt, is the Knox County clerk, and certainly lent her expertise and political know-how to that campaign. Corcoran actually won more precincts than Adam Thompson did, and Corcoran was probably better known. I don't know about just within the district. Certainly county-wide, Corcoran is better known than Adam Thompson coming into that race, but well known within the district as well. And Corcoran actually won 8 out of the 13 precincts there. But Thompson, he won 5 precincts. He only won 1 precinct that is in the urban or more suburban parts of that district, which is the Holston Hills neighborhood. The other 4 precincts that he won is a cluster of adjacent precincts up in the northeast corner of the county that essentially covers the Corryton and Gibbs areas. That's his home base. That's where his family farm is. He's the 6th generation working that farm. He is certainly very well known up there, even if he's not as well known in the rest of the district. And his margins of victory in those 4 precincts alone were sufficient to overcome the advantage that Corcoran had basically everywhere else in the district. And that's a result that you don't see that often, I would say. Like most often in a district race, the person who wins the most precincts will also be the person who gets the most votes. But it shows the value of really turning out your people. Absolutely.
Another thing that was interesting about that is Thompson's been very outspoken on the growth policy plan, especially in favor of preservation of farmland. A lot of the areas that are going to be affected by that, but switching from being classified as rural areas to planned growth areas are in that area.
Yeah.
And so I think that was, if there was a local issue that really drove that vote, that was it. And
absolutely.
And yes, he's well known there, but he's all. I think a lot of the voters in the Corryton Gibbs area look at him as a champion for their values.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And he very much presented himself that way, too. I mean, he's spoken at many public meetings exactly about that, about the need to preserve both, the farmland itself, but also kind of, the whole culture of that part of East Knox County, which still is our most rural area and our most agricultural area. And, I think the people who live in those parts of that district probably were more fired up to vote than people in the rest of the district, exactly because they have this very specific kind of looming concern. And so, I think all of that came together there. But anyway, interesting set of results there. And of course, we'll get to do it all again in August when we have general elections with contested races in almost all of those areas. All right, the City of Knoxville we talked about how this past week was not a week that people, our local governments scheduled a whole bunch of events or meetings, but the City of Knoxville did schedule a big announcement this past Tuesday. So what happened?
Well, that was they wanted to announce the largest grant that anybody in the city can remember receiving from the federal government. They nobody would say it was the largest ever because memories only go so far, and probably nobody would take the 4 to 5 days it would take to research. But it's a big grant. It's $42.6 million from the U.S. Department of Transportation. And it's through a program they call Reconnecting Communities. And this is a grant program that the Department of Transportation gives money to communities that have been affected by infrastructure coming in, interstates going through neighborhoods, and James White Parkway going through Knoxville, and this is important here, urban renewal in the 1960s and early 1970s. That played a big role in this, and what this does is it's going to fund a plethora of infrastructure projects in the city, mostly to do with greenways and parks and things like that, from mostly in East Knoxville, but also into South Knoxville as well. The idea is to the neighborhoods that were just east of downtown, where the Civic Coliseum, Auditorium and Coliseum are today, is a good landmark for it. But that whole area through there was predominantly African American up until the 1960s. Then with urban renewal, families were moved out, businesses moved out, and that neighborhood was completely, those neighborhoods were completely destroyed. And then James White Parkway kind of cut off access from that area to downtown. It's not completely cut off, but it's very difficult. It's seen as a barrier. So these projects, there's several of them that are already in the planning stages. The city was going to build these eventually, but this will really accelerate these being built. There'll be a greenway from the Botanical Gardens in East Knoxville into Harriet Tubman Park, which is real close to the new stadium. We're going to build some of the funds will go toward building a park underneath the James White Parkway overpass next to the stadium. Right now it's a parking lot in the recycling drop-off center.
It's a heavily used parking lot. I wonder if they have other parking places in mind.
Well,
for people to go.
I don't know. And there are also a couple of sex workers who work that area pretty heavily too.
I don't know anything about that.
Well,
if you say so, I take your word for
it. I'm not a patron. Don't get me wrong, but
you've been solicited.
I have been
saying.
solicited. Yes, but but it's interesting. I never, I knew it would be some kind of kind of a connection, a way to connect the old city with the stadium in a more pleasing way, a more aesthetically pleasing way. They don't have plans drawn up for it or anything yet, but it was interesting. One of our readers, who is a member of the Compass Colloquy on Facebook, our subscriber only Facebook group,
which you can join if you're a subscriber.
Yep.
And you can become a subscriber if you're not.
And they linked to something similar that was done in Birmingham, Alabama, and just a really neat park underneath the an interstate. It's a much larger area than this would be, but they had skateboard facilities in there and a walkway and benches and
right. Presumably, it's not going to be gardens because it's literally under an interstate.
Yeah, it's not going to be like a grassy, open space kind of park. What you think of as a park, it's not just because it's in the shade underneath James White Parkway and Hall of Fame Drive. So But that's interesting. Probably the biggest part of this, the part that will really be visible is they're going to extend a greenway from Morningside Park in East Knoxville across the South Knoxville Bridge and down James White Parkway all the way to the Urban Wilderness Gateway Park. And what's going to be interesting about that is they're going to take the current right-of-way that is James White Parkway. It's a 4-lane divided highway. They're going to cut it in half. They're going to move the northbound lanes over to the southbound lane half of the right-of-way. We're going to redo the roadways through there. So it'll still be a 4-lane road.
And this is just on the south side of the river, to be clear.
Yes, just on the south side of the river, from the end of the bridge to Gateway Park. But the other half of the right of way will be a linear park. We'll have a greenway in it, but it's much wider than just a greenway. It's not just a path along the side of the road. It's going to be landscaped and vegetation and all that. So that will be a real dramatic change. And it's something that the city had wanted to do for a while, but it was one of those projects that, well, if we ever get the money, maybe we'll be able to do it. Now they've got the money.
Yeah, and like you say, the city has been talking about that essentially ever since the decision was made finally to not build the rest of the James White Parkway, the extension that was originally going to go all the way down into Sevier County, and of course that change happened during the Rohero administration, where the extension of the James White Parkway was killed a couple of times. it kind of would get killed and then come back.
Zombie kept coming back, yeah.
But when it finally got killed for good, and TDOT essentially agreed to give control of that section of James White Parkway to the city, that has been envisioned as this, biking, walking, recreational corridor that would take up essentially half of the roadway that's there now on the south side of the river. That's pretty dramatic, and we see there's examples of this in other cities around the country and in other countries too. One of the biggest ones I'm aware of is in Madrid in Spain. They buried a huge, what would be the Spanish equivalent of an interstate through a major part of the city, and put a huge surface park on top of it. And so now the traffic goes under it. But, we have certainly talked a lot as a society over the last few decades about all of the damage that was done in the middle of the 20th century when we came in and just ran interstates straight through cities all over the place, and often chopped them up and cut off neighborhoods, often low-income neighborhoods, often neighborhoods with large non-white populations and so forth. And so there have been attempts in various ways in various places to remedy that. And so this is kind of a local example of that, going after this giant highway was built and kind of plunged partway into South Knoxville, now going back and kind of trying to reclaim that for the people who actually live in and around it.
Yes.
And in this case, connecting it, as you say, all the way across the river to East Knoxville and into Morningside Park and those areas.
Yeah, and one of another aspect of this grant funding that is more, they really pushed the urban renewal mitigation here. One of the things Mayor Kincannon and others said at the announcement last week was, we can't change what happened in the 60s and 70s, but we can try to make it better. And that's what this grant is doing, or there's hopes to do. But one of the things that is significant is they're going to also establish. The city's also going to establish an African American cultural corridor, essentially, running from the Beck Cultural Exchange Center, which is near Morningside Park, and but running from there down through the neighborhoods that had where the places where neighborhoods used to be and are now gone. It's going to have some pocket parks. It's going to have historical markers, things like that, to really make sure that dark part of Knoxville's history is not forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's what's the old joke about Americans are great at knocking things down and then naming them after the place or the people or whatever that they just displaced. For example, we have many Native American names in places where there are no longer many Native Americans. But like, as you say, at least it's acknowledging that, hey, there used to be something here.
Yeah, and there used to be, and I think that just about an overwhelming majority of people probably view urban renewal as a disaster for many African American communities, and not just in Knoxville, but in many other places as well. But one thing that was interesting, is very poignant, is a couple of people mentioned the late Bob Booker, who just recently passed away. We talked about him when he did die last month, and how he was the historian, essentially, of urban renewal here. He, at one point, was the executive director at the Beck Center. He's practically synonymous with the center, and how he would have, what he would have thought of them being able to get this grant, and he worked with them on it too. I mean, the grant is a lot of input from the Beck Center, as well as the African American Equity Restoration Task Force, which was created to do similar things, to go after grants that would help people in the African American community as an act of atonement for urban renewal and
remediation.
Yeah.
Well, and so this is a $42.6 million federal grant, and that task force had set a goal of attracting $100 million of investment into the community over 10 years. Does this account for, is this $40 million of that? Like, how are they counting?
Well, I asked those questions, and it was funny. I'd ask somebody with city government, well, that's a good question. It was like they were really concerned about getting the grant and not kind of, do we count it over here for the task force? The task force is going to be looking at the grant and see how much that they would be able to legitimately say, okay, this is because you could make the argument that the linear park in South Knoxville has nothing to do with urban renewal, and you could make the argument that it connects South Knoxville with the areas that were affected by urban renewal. You can make the argument either way. So they're going to take a look at that. I would imagine that a good chunk of this, at the very least, would go into the win column for them.
So when do they get this money, and how quickly can they actually start building these things?
They're going to. They said that they would be able to start in 2025. Mm-hmm. Now a lot of these projects they were already in the pipeline. Some of them have already been funded, or at least are in the capital improvements budget for over the next 5 years. So and that's going to be the city's match for this, and. So they're going to take a look at the projects, see which ones are quote unquote shovel ready, and then come up with a schedule. They don't have a schedule yet of when they're going to tackle all these projects, but they'll come up with that. I think they said that it would be a 7-phase project, and it will take years.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but it'll still happen faster than if they hadn't gotten the federal money.
Yeah, yes, we will probably be talking decades rather than years if they hadn't gotten the federal money.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think just one other point to make about that African American Equity Restoration Task Force, that organization or that task force has been a little controversial. It's been portrayed by some people outside city government as quote unquote reparations, which is a very loaded word that some people have very strong feelings about. When some city council members were running for re-election a couple of years ago, there were mailers against some of the incumbents accusing them of approving reparations without really defining it, but just saying that like this is a bad thing, that they're approving reparations, with the strong implication that they had put local taxpayers on the hook for $100 million of something, what was being portrayed as, handouts of some kind or something. But, that was never what that task force was set up to do. They were clear from the beginning that they were not envisioning, not that there would be no city money involved in these projects, but they were not talking about just $100 million of city money. That their real goal was to attract outside money, and this is obviously an example of that. This is not local taxpayer money. Now, it's federal taxpayer money, but it's federal taxpayer money that is being allocated to programs across the country, and so we're getting some of it here.
Might as well get some of it. Yeah, and one thing, too, is the Equity Restoration Task Force was Councilwoman Gwen McKenzie's idea, or not her idea, but she was the champion of it. She's the one who persuaded her colleagues to establish it. She was very clear that this is not a reparations program. They're not just going to write checks to people, and that what she envisioned and what they envision are getting grants for programs that will help restore some of the generational wealth that was lost, because all those people that got moved out, all those businesses, and there were hundreds of businesses, and there's only one left. There's only one business in Knoxville that survived urban renewal, and Jardigan and Sons Mortuary, and so it's in many ways, a lot of Knoxville's African American population hasn't really recovered from that, and so this is to they envision this as bringing in programs that will help people with home ownership and things like that, and and create wealth, and one of the things that this project will do is increase the connections, the community, and one of the things that they talked about is, it will improve, especially bicycle and foot connections between East Knoxville and the stadium, the old city, downtown, where there are jobs.
Yeah, and a lot of time, people can be sort of cynical about, is a greenway really going to do economic development? And, you can certainly understand that skepticism. But I will say I've been in a couple of other cities. I can think of one in Atlanta and one in New Orleans, where the cities have invested in biking and walking corridors, long ones that go on for a mile or a couple of miles. And you really do, in fact, see a lot, and a lot of times the two I'm thinking of do go through some former industrial areas and so forth. And in those areas, you do actually see there has been new residential development and new commercial development because those amenities become attractions in and of themselves. And they also draw people maybe into and through parts of the city that they might have ignored otherwise. And suddenly a vacant lot that was off your radar is like right next to you as you're biking or walking from one place to another, and it becomes much more attractive for somebody to do something with. And so, I mean, obviously not a panacea, and there's no guarantee that just because you build a nice greenway that you're going to spur economic development. But those kinds of quality of life amenities do often go hand in hand with encouraging different kinds of investment.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the, just, one of the selling points in parts of West Knoxville are the greenways. And that was another aspect that was brought up. Basically, East Knoxville deserves greenways too, and there aren't many. So,
Right.
So it will, the greenway, the East Knoxville Greenway that they're talking about from the Botanical Garden to Harriet Tubman Park will also connect to Morningside Park and the South Knoxville Greenway and into the old city near the stadium, or to the stadium actually. There's going to be a greenway that goes through Austin Homes, or First Creek at Austin, First Creek at Austin to the stadium itself. You can, the people who've lived in First Creek in Austin can walk just a short distance and be at the stadium.
Without even having to be on a sidewalk next to a street. You can just
walk down down a path.
Yep.
So and those types of amenities do factor into people's decisions on where to invest or where to live.
Yep. All right. Well, big news for the city, and obviously we will be covering the various pieces of that as it presumably comes to fruition. A couple things wanted to mention in the legislature. There was no action on the bill that we have talked about before, which could potentially prevent State Representative Gloria Johnson from running for two offices at once this year, because she is both running for the U.S. Senate. She's seeking the Democratic nomination to challenge Senator Marsha Blackburn for her seat in November, but she is also running for re-election to her state house seat, District 90, and she has made pretty clear that should she happen to win both of those, she would take the Senate seat, and then there would have to be an appointment and probably special election for the 90th district seat. But of course, there's been this bill sponsored by two Knox County Republicans, State Senator Richard Briggs and State Representative Dave Wright, that would prevent anybody from appearing twice on the same ballot. You couldn't be on the same ballot for two different offices. Right now, Johnson will be. If nothing changes, she's going to be on the August 1st primary ballot for both the state rep seat and the Senate. And the state Senate has already passed a version of this bill, and so that's sitting there waiting for action from the state house. But the bill in the House has not moved for 3 weeks. It got bumped again this past week, rolled to March 19th, and it's coming. There's some disagreement about the legalities of all this, but the assertion that has been made by the Republicans supporting the bill is if the legislature passed it and Governor Bill Lee signed it before April 4th, which is the deadline for people to file a petition to run for state and federal offices this year, that it could take effect for this year's election. If they passed it after that April 4th deadline, then that legality gets a lot murkier, because then you have people who have legally qualified to run and been certified as candidates, and can you then knock them off the ballot? Anyway, it's been the reason that this is hung up is not because there's some disagreement among House Republicans about how much they dislike Gloria Johnson. We know that the House Republicans dislike Gloria Johnson. They came within one vote of expelling her from her seat last year. She's very unpopular with Republicans. The problem that the bill sponsors have is that in some counties, especially in some smaller, more rural counties, it's apparently not that uncommon for some people to hold more than one office, not just to run for more than one office, but to hold more than one office. There are people who are county commissioners and state legislators, or there are people who are school board members and city council members and that kind of thing. And so a bunch of representatives have raised concerns about that. it seems to be kind of stuck. And so if it goes another week or so, you're going to say, well, they don't have time to get this done in time to affect Johnson's race. And of course, Briggs and Wright have said all along that they're not aiming this at Johnson, that it came out of conversations about something that happened in Farragut a few years ago. But it is also clear, because there has been a lot of talk about the timeline and that April 4th date, that the Republicans are certainly aware of the potential of this to negatively impact Johnson. And if it doesn't end up passing out of the House, it will not be because, at least in most cases, I think it won't be because the Republicans have taken pity on Johnson. It will be because they're protecting their own people in their own districts. Anyway, for now, that is stalled, and it is looking increasingly likely that Johnson will, in fact, be on the ballot for both of those offices. But, of course, we'll see what happens there. A bill that did just passed the Senate on Thursday after having previously passed the House, is interesting because while it does not directly affect anything Knoxville is doing right now, it limits what Knoxville could do when it comes to certain kinds of accountability for local law enforcement. And what this came out of was an ordinance passed in Memphis last year, and people probably remember the killing last year of Tyree Nichols, who was a young man in Memphis, FedEx worker, was, I think, just driving home from work. He was like 2 blocks from his mother's house when he got pulled over by Memphis police on what turned out to be completely pretextual grounds. They said that they pulled him over for reckless driving, but actually later, because this was investigated ultimately by many agencies, when they went and looked at the tapes, the dash cam videos, the police department acknowledged there was actually no reckless driving that anybody could see. Nevertheless, he ended up being pulled over and was approached by very aggressive officers who ultimately pulled him out of the car, got into a physical confrontation with him, were trying to hold him down and handcuff him and pepper sprayed him, all without, and the videos are out there if anybody wants to go watch them, but all while he's begging and pleading and saying, what are you doing? I'm just going to my mom's house. Like, why are you even doing this? I haven't done anything. And he, at one point, when pepper spray got deployed, it also got in some of the officers' eyes, because nothing about this whole situation clearly was handled remotely professionally by the police involved. He got up to run away, which the police then took as a great offense and went chasing after him. And when they caught him, then they were twice as angry or whatever. And not to put too fine a point on it, but they beat him brutally, put him in the hospital, and then he ended up dying from the injuries. It became now he was black, as were all 5 officers who pulled him over, which is not that unusual in Memphis, which is a majority black city. All 5 of those officers ended up being not just fired, but charged with second-degree murder and multiple other felonies. A bunch of other officers and some EMTs who responded to the scene also ended up being fired and or charged in relation to it. So there was absolutely no argument or dispute that what happened to Tyree Nichols was appalling and was completely unjustified by anything he did. So, of course, there were protests throughout Memphis, lots of outrage, and the city council took various steps to address this. One of the things they did was they passed a law basically reclassifying minor traffic offenses. So we're talking about things like broken taillights, expired tags on your license plate, those kind of very minor, non-moving violation things, just something that a police officer sees on your car, like, oh, that car's out of compliance, and will then use that as an excuse to pull people over. And law enforcement is very clear that these are called pretextual stops, meaning you're using a pretext to stop somebody that you have some other reason to stop them. And law enforcement does not in any way deny that they do this. They do this routinely. It's part of their toolkit. Is it's like, here's this drug dealer that or suspected drug dealer that we've been following and keeping tabs on, and we've built up enough evidence against him that now it's time to take him in. So we're just going to follow him for a few blocks and wait for some reason to pull him over, even if it's just something like quote unquote reckless driving in the case of Tyree Nichols. Although it is not clear at all why they targeted Tyree Nichols, or maybe they thought he was somebody else or something. There was nothing about him that they were after. But anyway, this is something that police do routinely. There have been studies of this that have shown, like multiple studies. There was a huge one in California looking at literal millions of traffic stops, but there's been some in other parts of the country. And what they find is that these pretextual stops are used disproportionately against Black and Latino drivers. And so a larger number of people who get stopped and then often searched, sometimes even handcuffed in these cases, are Black and Latino than you would expect given their proportion of the population. And also, of the people who get stopped on pretextual grounds, Black and Latino drivers are less likely to actually end up being charged with anything than other drivers who are stopped, which presumably means that when they stop drivers who are not Black or Latino, a lot of times they might have a better reason to do it. Whereas with Black and Latino drivers, if you're stopping a bunch of people disproportionately, but then also letting them go disproportionately, what that means is that a bunch of people are getting stopped and searched for no really apparent reason. And that though any police stop, as the Tyree Nichols case illustrated, any police stop can escalate to violence and can end up, with tragic circumstances. And so the Memphis City Council passed an ordinance that just reclassified those offenses and said these offenses are not in and of themselves. It's like, yes, if you pull somebody over for speeding and they also have a broken tail light, fine, write them a ticket for the broken taillight. You can't pull them over just for the broken taillight. Right. You can't use these simply pretextual reasons to pull somebody over. And that was not enough to satisfy the community activists in Memphis who actually wanted a much more intensive. There was a draft ordinance drawn up, a comprehensive policing ordinance that would have dramatically affected police operations in many ways and imposed other kinds of accountability measures on the Memphis Police Department. That did not pass. And so this ordinance that passed was, in a way, the compromise ordinance. And we can sort of envision something similar happening here where, you have some incident that gets people in the community very upset and calling for change. City council eventually comes and passes something, which is not as much as community groups and activists want, but it's still something. And Tyree Nichols' family was very supportive of this, and they felt like had this ordinance been in place at the time, he probably never would have been pulled over at all and would still be alive and working at FedEx where he was an employee. But Memphis, the previous Memphis mayor, Jim Strickland, actually opposed it, and he refused to even enforce this ordinance. And so even though it was passed by city council last year, there's no indication that it's actually had any impact on the way the Memphis Police Department is doing their job. But Memphis just elected a new mayor, Paul Young, who has said that, yes, this was passed by city council and I will enforce this ordinance. And so it's sitting there, ready to be, or is maybe being enforced now. He took office in January. And so the Republican supermajority in the legislature did not like this. And a couple of Memphis area Republicans argued that, Memphis is a city with chronically high crime rate. And they basically painted this as you're tying police officers' hands, you're taking valuable tools away from them, and that there have, in fact, been major arrests made of people who were wanted on serious charges that resulted from these pretextual traffic stops. And so this bill that has passed now, both the House and the Senate, is going to Governor Lee for his signature, which I'm sure he will sign it. will nullify that Memphis ordinance, and it basically says that no local government in the state can impose any restrictions on policing activity that go beyond what is already regulated by state and federal law. And so basically, if there's no state or federal law that says an officer can't pull over anyone they want on whatever pretextual grounds they come up with, then the city cannot do it. And of course, this comes a year after the legislature they've passed a few bills, but they just passed the most recent one last year, severely limiting and conscribing the authority of local civilian review boards, community advisory boards that have in some cases, or used to have, the ability to, for example, initiate their own investigations of allegations of police misconduct. The legislature last year restricted that and said, no, those kinds of boards can only be advisory, and that any kind of investigation of police misconduct can only be performed by the police themselves, can only be performed by law enforcement agencies, whether it's local or the TBI or, the feds or whoever. And on the one hand, Scott, this is in line with kind of a strong, quote unquote, back the blue movement that you hear on the right, where there's a lot of sympathy and support for law enforcement and suspicion of people who are skeptical of law enforcement. But you could also look at it as literally telling, the Memphis Police Department is paid for by the people of Memphis, just as the Knoxville Police Department is funded by the people of Knoxville. And it is kind of chipping away at local control of our own police. It's telling us that as citizens of a city with a police department, our options for holding our own employees accountable are limited.
Yeah, it is part of a trend in doing that. A lot of Republican state legislators, view state legislatures in general as being the intended most powerful bodies by the Constitution of the United States, and so they used to appoint, the state legislatures used to appoint U.S. senators. And so they could tell the federal government what to do. They could tell local governments what to do. They look at the state legislature as holding, as being the legitimate center of authority, period. And kind of discount the local control idea. And it is manifesting itself in many ways. So, the Knoxville Police Department does use pretextual stops. I myself have been stopped on one of those years ago, and
in your shadier younger years.
My shadier younger years. Well, one of the things is I had a beat up Toyota Corolla, and it was red. There was one other red, beat-up-looking Toyota Corolla hatchback in Knoxville. I saw it from time to time in front of what appeared to be a drug house.
Uh-huh.
And I myself was driving, actually, it was Hill Avenue. So I was, in kind of the area where, and late at night, I was leaving from the News Sentinel when I worked there. And my tag had expired, and so they pulled me over and wrote me a ticket because I had an expired tag. I obviously wasn't beaten up or anything, but it was definitely a pretextual stop. So.
Well, and you are a white guy,
and I am a white guy. Yes, that's a difference. So for people who scoff at the idea of white privilege, there you go.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's just an interesting, there's this kind of idea that conservatives or Republicans are more skeptical of government power. And there's a lot of talk on the right about wanting smaller government. But when it comes to the actual government agencies with the most power in terms of their very real ability to affect people's lives. I mean, police departments are the only institutions we have that have the legal right to detain you, to imprison you, to physically engage with you, and in some cases to kill you, because we have plenty of cases of people who die in confrontations with police where, I mean, in this case, the officers were charged. As we know, there's lots of cases where somebody who was pulled over for, again, pretextual reasons or no particularly good reason or whatever, ends up dead at the end of a confrontation with the police, and the police are found to be, acting totally within their rights and their power because they have so much power. They are granted so much power by local and state government. And so it's just kind of ironic, maybe, or maybe predictable, depending on how you look at these things, that the political view that allegedly is most suspicious of government power makes this huge exception for the agency that actually can not just tax you or, cite you for not mowing your lawn, but haul you out of your house in the middle of the night and maybe even kill you. But that group, that agency, we're going to say, no, we don't want to hamper their power. Yeah. We want to hamper other government power, but not that particular government power. And, what this tells you is that this is all about the perception of who the police actually serve. And so there is a perception on the right, I think, that the police serve, their supporters, let's say. And who are the supporters of people on the right? They're disproportionately white and disproportionately suburban, disproportionately rural. And that if the police are doing anything bad, those aren't the people they're doing it to. Whereas, and it's interesting in a way, because really the right and left are kind of agreeing here, because the right is kind of saying, well, the police serve our people. They serve and protect our people. And you get people on the left, and especially, African Americans, people of color, and left-wing activists and whatever, saying the police do not serve and protect our people. They oppress our people. And in a way, there's not really exactly a conflict between those positions. Like, both of those things could very well be true, and both parties would just sort of be acting according to the interests of what they perceive as, their own voters and their own constituents. I think that it is incontestable that if we had a case like Tyree Nichols happen in Farragut to, I don't know, a Starbucks manager or something like that who was white, there would be a huge outcry about it. But on the other hand, we had an incident with a Starbucks manager who was black out at Cedar Bluff that nobody, apart from people in the African American community, raised questions, but nobody else did. And so, this is one of those areas where I feel like we can't get away from the racial framing that so much of our politics just carries with it inherently. And people get very touchy about this when you bring it up and suggest that, well, maybe you're acting in ways that, are affected by the actual race of the people involved. But if you look at the track record, like, who gets affected by these things? It's here you had a majority black city, and you had a black man who died after confrontation with the police, and the city council comes and says, okay, we want to better protect our people who live in this city. And you have the majority white state legislature saying, no, you can't. I mean, that's what's going on here. And as somebody, I've had a lot of encounters with police departments as a reporter, and then when I worked at the City of Knoxville as well. And let me tell you, like, as a reporter, I'm deeply skeptical of many functions of government, but I am especially skeptical of handing unbridled power to people with guns and the authority to, just come in and interrupt people's lives and haul them away and everything. Personally, I think that's the kind of government power that we as reporters are, and hopefully our community wants to try to hold accountable and keep in check, but we're being told by our state government that we're not allowed to.
Yeah, I think for me, this is a real, just glaring example of not trusting local governments to do what is best for they think is best for their community. Obviously the state has to have reasonably uniform things. I mean, you don't want laws to be completely different in Maryville than they are in Alcoa, but they're also, one of the principles is that it has really driven, the development of America, is this idea of local control over local issues. Mm-hmm. And if a community wants to change the way its policing is done, by
its own police force that it is paying for itself, and
within reason, they can, they should be able to do that. I think that's a very kind of fundamental value that people across the spectrum have. If you can, you talk to people in small towns or in suburban areas that they want to control what goes on in their area. The people in Choteau, we talked about that. With they don't want affordable housing in Choteau, and they, by golly, made sure that everybody knew it. And they would say that we should have a voice in what is built in our community, and they I think that principle is pretty universal, and that sometimes the legislature, like I said, this is where that conflict is, where the legislature thinks that legislators think that they are the ultimate decision makers for local governments.
Yep, absolutely. And that plays out in many different ways, but I think in policing it is especially fraught because we have decisions being made mostly by legislators who live in more suburban and rural areas where their populations feel protected by police, and they are overriding the concerns of people who live in areas where, for really many pretty solid historic reasons, people are much more skeptical of police. And they're kind of, imposing a little bit of a police state on the people of Memphis, saying you do not have control over your own police. And that's an interesting trend. All right. There was another interesting thing on the sort of local economic development front here this week, Scott, that you wrote about having to do with am I reading this right? A golf complex of some kind in North Knoxville?
Yes. What this is it's a proposal to build a golf-themed entertainment venue complex, whatever you want to call it. It would be very similar to Topgolf, which, go ahead and get that out of the way. It's not Topgolf, but it would be very similar to one.
For people who aren't familiar with Topgolf, you want to explain what Topgolf is?
What I'll do is I'll explain what this is. This is going to be called Shot Club Social, which I dare anyone to say 3 times fast. I'm not going to try. But what they have there is they have these outdoor bays covered outdoor bays where you can go and it's kind of like a driving range, but a fun one. They've got all kinds of things that go on out there to things you can hit to keep score and different various games and things like that. There's also going to be a sports bar, a Tennessee themed sports bar. There's going to be an arcade. They're going to have duck pin bowling. They're going to have all kinds of activities there, so it's a family place as well. They're also hope to have an outdoor miniature golf course there, and so there's all kinds of golf related things. It's kind of interesting. The lead investor here is Spike McCamey, who is owns a construction company that actually builds on a lot of golf courses. It's one of the things. He's an avid golfer. He and his late father got to know some people who in Buffalo, New York, who own a high-tech golf ball manufacturing company called Encore. And they got together and started dreaming up this concept to do this. And the one thing about Topgolf, which it's more, they go out into suburban areas. The one in Knox County is in Farragut. Their concept is to do it in a more urban area that's underserved. So they're going to open one in Buffalo, where Encore is headquartered, and one here in Knoxville, because Spike McCamey lives here. And it's going to be up on next to I-275 in North Knoxville. There's a strip. If you're going north, industrial strip there to the right, off the interstate there.
Right. This is sort of just north of downtown.
Yeah, just north of downtown. In fact, the southern end of this property, it's going to end up being about 10 and a half acres when they've got one more parcel they're trying to get a hold of. But it's the south end of it. It's on Fifth Avenue. Will front Fifth Avenue. The bulk of it will front Marion Street, which runs parallel to I-275. And there's Second Creek is on the backside of the building, and then Old Gray Cemetery beyond there. So if you're trying to visualize where this is, Old Gray Cemetery, Fifth Avenue, I-275.
Right. It's kind of just west of Old Gray Cemetery, across the creek, essentially.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And but McCamey and his partners are going to invest $30 to $35 million in this. It's going to create, they think, 250 jobs. Some of them will be part-time. Some of them will be, kind of low-paying. I mean, they're going to be, people who go and gather up the golf balls out of the range. So, but there are also going to be some managers and other, a variety of jobs that will be coming in. The one thing that they're also going to do is partner with organizations that make it they have a mission to reach kids through golf, and one way or another, particularly inner city kids. So they're one of the organizations that they're going to work with is called First Tee Tennessee. They work with kids at Green Magnet Academy and at Emerald Youth Foundation to teach values through golf is kind of how they put it. Currently, they're based out of the Williams Creek golf course in East Knoxville. In the winter, they want to keep having activities. They've gone out to Topgolf and some other places around here where they have golf simulators and keep the kids active that way. But these are kids who live in the inner city. Those are all way out in the suburbs, and so there's kind of a drop off in the winter. and what they're hoping is they're going to work with them, get free, they'll get free time at the range and everything else, and to keep more kids active in golf through the winter, and they hope to be able to not lose any through inactivity for several months. So that's kind of an interesting twist on it. That's one of the reasons they wanted to locate it in an urban area rather than a suburban area. And they just think, I'm just from a business standpoint, there are a lot of people who live in Knoxville who don't go out to Farragut for things or don't go to Sevier County for things, and so they think that there's a good strong market. They think that Spike was telling me that he thinks that the entertainment market in general in the downtown area is lacking. And you've got the Maple Hall where you can bowl, and what else?
Well, apart from movie theaters and music, recreational activity type.
Right, yeah, that's what that's what he was meaning by that, by active participation things, and that is going to come up, and because we're already talking about this here, this is something that's going to happen at City Council next week. I know we're not talking about next week's stuff yet, but I'll go ahead and touch on it here. They've had to close portions of streets. This is this site is a former metals recycling center. So it had sections of streets that jutted into it, and the city's basically going to close those and turn them over to Shot Club Social, and then there's some brownfield remediation. There's some brownfield remediation. Right? They're already talking with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. They have a program where they're going to help them pay for cleaning up that. Then what they also want to do, and this is on council's agenda for Tuesday, is they are seeking a payment in lieu of tax agreement, a 9-year agreement that basically freezes their property taxes for that period of time, and then that helps them get their financing for a project, because this is the type of project that banks are leery of funding. So right now they pay the tax bill for a year for that property is about $7,600. And that'll stay the same. It's between the city and the county. That'll stay the same till the pilot period ends. When the pilot period ends, though, $320,000 a year will be an estimated $320,000 a year is what they'd be paying.
Right.
So, but that will come up for a vote on Tuesday.
And the city can maybe somewhat declare victory on that, because it is right along that I-275 access corridor that the city has invested in improving that road right along 275 there, with the explicit intention of trying to open up some of that former industrial land for reuse. I don't know that a recreational golf facility was exactly what any city planners had in mind, but I mean, it's a reuse of a long vacant parcel.
I will tell you this: no, they did not have that in mind. Rebecca J. Justice, who's the chief urban planner and development officer for the city, said, we did not anticipate this. It was the idea, and the city spent over $5 million to kind of reconfigure Marion, make it easier access from Fifth Avenue to there, and also from the other direction. The next interstate exit there is Baxter Avenue, and you can get off of Baxter Avenue and zip down Marion Street to this site very easily, and they did that thinking, okay, maybe it'll attract industry. We've got this nice big parcel here, no, but they're they seem to be delighted. I mean, one of the things is yeah, they're going to have this pilot that freezes their property taxes, but they're also going to be generating sales tax. And so, and of course, we don't know how much sales tax, but there's not generating any sales tax now. Mm-hmm. So, and it's also going to be, it's going to be highly visible. There as you're coming into the city from the north, and coming into the downtown area from north. You're already in the city, but coming into the downtown area, and so the city is, at least the city administration's pretty enthusiastic about it. So,
yeah, I do think that's something that can be funny about economic development is that sometimes people have an exaggerated sense of how much local governments can control any of that, and so you'll hear about some new business coming or something, and one thing I hear people say sometimes is, well, was that what was intended? I remember one of my friends, one of our mutual friends, the late great Michael Haynes, yes. R.I.P. Michael, complaining at a certain point when there was a peanut shop had opened on Market Square, which is no longer there. And by the way, I liked the peanut shop. I enjoyed it. Michael was not a fan of the peanut shop, but I remember him saying, was this what any of this was supposed to be? When we redeveloped Market Square, was this for a peanut shop? And it's like, well, it's the goal a lot of times from the public side is to make it as easy as possible to attract investment. And so you get your, whether that's through brownfield remediation or doing the kind of infrastructure improvements you're talking about, make it easier for people to get to a particular place, make it easier for somebody to come in and just go ahead and build on it. But they don't control and can't really control beyond, zoning and those kinds of regulations, what somebody decides to do. You're just kind of setting the table. You're
right.
Not designing the menu or whatever metaphor
right.
you want to use. And so, right, maybe a recreational golf facility, which of course still has to get built. Like just because somebody has announced something doesn't necessarily mean this is going to happen, but this is what they're planning to do. But that may not be what was in anyone's master plan. But that's who showed up and has an idea and has the resources to do it. And so, of such things are cities made.
That's true. That's true. You never know when. One thing. Sometimes city council members are kind of fall into that trap too, because one of the things they are talking about is how they want mixed use development along the city's corridors. They really say that's what we need to focus on to bring in more housing. But one thing they can't do is control what kinds of developments people want who actually own the property and would invest the money want to pursue.
Right.
If any at all. You can hope for something, but then there are limits to your ability to make it so.
And as a city, as a local government, a use that is, appropriate within existing zoning and so on and so forth, any use is better than no use.
Yeah.
Because as you say, that property has been sitting there vacant for decades. Like, I don't know how long. I can't remember.
I did not ask and don't know how long that property has been vacant, but it's been a long time.
And there's nothing preventing it from continuing to sit vacant for the next 20 years unless somebody shows up and wants to do something with it. So
this property you're talking about zoning, it's zoned for industrial use.
Right.
They're going to have to get it rezoned for commercial use now.
Right.
So.
Which is actually kind of a down zoning. I mean, it's a less intensive use of the property than what's allowed there. Well, be interesting to see. I am not personally a golfer, but if this were there and it's only maybe 5 minutes from my house, sure, I'll check it out. I'm
not really a golfer either, but I've been known to do the miniature golf thing.
Sure.
Everything.
My kids like miniature golf too. Absolutely.
I've never done duck pin bowling, but give it a shot. See what that's all about. So there's and one of the things is they're talking about this sports bar, the one thing that Spike McCamey talked about was the type of a big sports bar like Fieldhouse Social in near UT's campus. There aren't many of them that have just huge dozens of TVs and things like that. And that's kind of what his vision is for that, to have the sports bar to be an attraction in and of itself.
Right. One of the places people go to watch the big games,
right,
and so on and so forth.
And one thing that you can't discount, you don't think about it that much, but the Central Street corridor is just a couple of blocks away from this, and it's really growing. Axel Logistics is over there. There are a lot of relatively new restaurants, bars, Happy Hollers close by. So there's a lot of energy in that area, and while it's not technically in that area, it's pretty close.
I don't want to derail us, but Lord Seth Barber, our producer, is also a proprietor of a bar in Happy Holler. Seth, what are your thoughts on golf coming into the neighborhood?
I don't know. I was looking at the map while you guys were talking about it. I agree in principle that that's a weird spot, that you weren't going to put much good in there. As a bar owner, to have another bar there, I would prefer it to be like a machine shop or something like that, where I can have some guys come in and get lunch with me instead of a competitor. But shameless self-promotion, we're doing Hollaroo.co, go check it out. The underlying goal of Hollaroo is to put Happy Holler back on the map as an entertainment district, to try to grow that part of Knoxville proper into kind of an old city with a little less baseball. It's kind of one of the pushes we're kind of going after.
Old city with golf,
right? And so we can, anything to grow the neighborhood, I'm good with. I think it's exciting. Again, with the Hollaroo being an attempt to try to put the Holler back on the map, get the city's attention, get the city helping do some of the things that the city can do, like you said, to set the table for growth. There's plenty of buildings down there that have been vacant or nearly vacant or are falling down or some combination thereof, that some of these guys that own the properties haven't had the right incentives in place yet to spend the money to either tear down and build a new something or rehab one of these cool old buildings into a usable space again. Anything that pushes that direction is good with me, because what's the rising tides? Right. All boats, right? And I want to be one of those boats.
Well, you literally have a boat inside your bar.
Yeah, also true.
Pirate bar there on North Central Street. The bar is a boat.
It is a 60-foot pirate ship, indeed.
All right. Okay. Well, speaking of economic development and growth, we have an interview coming up now with Mandi Benedict, who's the Community Services Manager, or Constituent Services Manager, for Knox County Mayor Glenn Jacobs, and she has kind of been tasked with riding herd on the Advance Knox planning process for the mayor's office. And of course, we've talked about that a lot in recent months. We've had changes approved to the growth policy plan by County Commission and City Council, and a vote still to come on that in Farragut later this month. And then the comprehensive land use plan that we talked about last week that came through the Planning Commission and will go to County Commission for approval. And so we thought it was a good time to just check in with Mandi, kind of get our bearings, remember where we are in this process that's been going on now for 2 years, and what the next steps are over the next several months, and really actually over the next couple of years. So let's go to that interview. All right, we are joined this week on the podcast by Mandi Benedict, who is the Constituent Services Manager for Knox County Mayor Glenn Jacobs, and among her duties in that job has been overseeing the Advance Knox process, which is now working its way through multiple avenues in our local government. We thought it was just a good time to kind of catch up and see how things are going. So Mandi, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jesse.
For people who haven't been paying attention, and of course we have been covering this kind of from the start, but I think like a lot of these public processes, people tend to pay a lot more attention at the end of them than they do at the beginning when it comes time to actually make decisions. So can you just give us kind of a quick summary of where we have been through this process, because we're right at about 2 years in, right, from when the first kind of public input session started. So what's this all about? And kind of really quickly, what has happened to bring us to where we are?
We are 2.5 years in. County Commissioner approved a contract with Kimley Horn in October of 2021. We have spent the last 2 years meeting with community members, different stakeholders, just trying to define where we want to grow and how we want Knox County to grow, because we hear month after month status quo is not getting it done. And so this is the way for us to plan for the next 20 years as people continue to move here.
And as you conducted those public meetings, and I went to several of those, I know that some themes emerged, some common concerns and priorities. What was kind of like the big picture takeaway of what Knox Countyans said they want to see as the county continues to grow over the next 20 years?
So there were 2 equal themes throughout every part of the county. And one of them was preserve our farmland, preserve our heritage, what we love about Knox County, but also allow different housing opportunities. So we heard that in every district of the county.
And when we talk about different housing opportunities, what does that mean exactly? Like what are people saying when they say we want more options?
So one part of this would be to allow mixed use development in the county. We heard that people would like to shop where they live. They don't want to travel far to go to the grocery store. And so if you look at the different place types in the comprehensive plan, you will see that we have some mixed use development, some town center development. And so that's a different housing opportunity than we currently have in Knox County.
And that's also something that can produce resistance sometimes. And I guess one of the tricky things with these kinds of planning processes is that people on the one hand will kind of say they favor something conceptually, but then when it comes down to what's going to happen right down the road from them, they can be a lot more particular about it. So I guess as you all pulled all of that together and came up with the couple of proposed changes and plans that we're dealing with now, how did you try to balance those kinds of things? That on the one hand, people say, yeah, I'd love, my kids who are going to graduate from college to be able to have a place they could afford here. But also, I don't really want more traffic on my rural road or whatever. How do you balance those things?
I think you will see those more intense place types closer to the city than the rural area, where we already have existing infrastructure in place to accommodate that type of development.
So the first major step that we've gone through in the last few months to start implementing this was the growth policy plan, which we talked about here on the podcast a fair amount. Mm-hmm. And, the changes there did a couple of significant things, but obviously the one everybody kind of focused on was the map itself, right? Because the growth map is this very big picture thing that just identifies these are the rural areas, these are the planned growth areas, and then these are the urban areas. And you all did make some adjustments as you went through that. There were a couple of meetings of the Growth Policy Coordinating Committee. What were the kind of, trade-offs or adjustments you made in response to what you heard from that? Okay.
So from our original amendment, we heard from both sides, the farmers and also the development community. Some of them weren't happy with what we had proposed in the rural area. Some of them weren't happy with the expanded planned growth area that we have. So one thing that we really looked at was the density in the rural area. We decreased density by a third. We went from 3 dwelling units to an acre per acre to 2. Also, making sure that there's that coordinated infrastructure with it. So they have to, if they get approved, they would have to expand the road, or it has to be on an 18-foot wide road. Also, there was a lot of conversation about the Hillside Ridgetop plan. We changed the language to that to follow whatever the legislative body has passed. And I know County Commission will have that discussion whenever the comprehensive plan comes before them. So those are two huge things that I think was a great compromise for the community.
And then there were also about 3 square miles, right, of rural area that was originally going to be changed to planned growth that was taken out of that and left as rural, right?
Yes, correct. We met with our utility partners again and just showed them the map, talked to them about feasibility of expanding utilities right there. And it was just going to be too expensive for development. And so we thought that that was a great place just to compromise with them also.
Well, one thing about the growth policy plan, of course, it has to be passed by all 3 legislative bodies within the county, and it's passed city council, it's passed county commission, getting ready to for a vote at the Farragut Board of Mayor and Aldermen. What kind of outreach and education have you had to do with city council members who may not have paid as much attention, since since this plan really applies outside the corporate limits, and also the Farragut Board of Mayor and Aldermen, because they're the ones who voted down the change to the growth policy plan last time this came up.
Correct. So this comprehensive plan started because of the last time when the Farragut Board of Aldermen voted it down. That is one thing that we heard from Farragut and City Council, that they wanted Knox County to update our general plan before we looked at the growth policy plan. And the mayor took it one step further and created this comprehensive land use and transportation plan to look at them both together. Throughout the process, we have done project briefings with City Council and with Board of Aldermen. I think that we've probably met with them at least 3 or 4 times. And then once the Growth Policy Committee passed the amendment that was proposed, we did a workshop with City Council and the Mayor, Board of Aldermen, and County Commission, just to really dive into those details of the amendment so they would have a better understanding of what they were voting on.
And it has, as Scott says, it has come through commission now and City Council, the last proposed change was a more modest one, but it cleared both those bodies. And as Scott said, it got held up in Farragut. Are you relatively confident of support from the Farragut folks? Are they comfortable with where this is now?
We are hopeful for support with the town of Farragut, yes. We have worked with them a lot on this. We had David Smoke was on our technical committee. We have spoke with them about infrastructure. I've worked with them. They have a separate future land use map. And so we've really looked at their future land use map and compared it to the one that we have, just to make sure that they're, in rhythm. So we have been great community partners with them, and they have been great community partners with us in developing this plan. I'm hopeful for a yes vote on growth policy.
So then, as you mentioned, so that's the growth policy plan, which sets that big map. And then alongside that, there is this comprehensive land use and transportation plan. You've added that transportation piece in. So I guess, first of all, can you just talk about that, why the decision, why it was deemed important to include transportation planning alongside the general plan update, because that wasn't part of the last general plan.
Correct. So one thing that you hear, or we hear every single month, is that our roads cannot handle any more growth. And so looking at the growth together so we can go ahead and be proactive in planning for that infrastructure, that was important to the mayor in developing this comprehensive plan. And
what do you think that adds when you have because the comprehensive plan includes, like you say, the future land use map, which more specifically than the growth policy map, identifies exactly where, greater intensities of development could go and so forth. What is the advantage of having that accompanied by, it really is like a list of road projects, essentially, that are identified and prioritized in there?
It will help Jim with his capital improvement plan. It will help.
Jim Snowden, the
Yes.
Director of Engineering and Public Works. Yeah.
Correct. Sorry. It will help him when preparing his capital improvement plans, but also it'll help the county with being able to budget. This is where we see growth coming. So we're not chasing the growth like we have with Shod Road is a great example.
So this came through Planning Commission this month and was recommended for approval, is now going to County Commission. And I guess they'll probably talk about it at their work session on Monday, but I know they're going to have an actual workshop on this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Next Thursday.
County Commission, it is on their March agenda. We have deferred it to April already.
Oh, okay.
They do have
We're breaking news here. I wasn't even aware of that. So
yes.
It's not going to be on this month's agenda. It'll be on the April agenda.
Correct. Yes. They are having a workshop, and we will host a public forum at that workshop too on March 21st.
And what kinds well, I guess, Scott, maybe you can talk to this a little bit because you covered this at Planning Commission. I'm just curious what kinds of issues and questions have come up with that plan as opposed to the growth policy plan, which is a bigger picture plan. This one's more detailed. What are the kinds of decisions that are being made here at this level?
Well, the biggest question that came up at Planning Commission was about the hilltop or the hillside and ridgetop protection part. They were very divided on it. There are some planning commissioners who think that it should be a mandatory policy to be followed. Others think that it should remain an advisory document. And I don't know, Mandi, if you're in your experience going through this, was there as much a division on that as there was at Planning Commission? And I know what they wanted to, they almost amended it. And then they decided, no, we'll just send a letter to County Commission telling them that they ought to look at it. So what did you hear when you were talking to stakeholders and people in the public about the hillside and ridgetop protection aspect of it?
I think that it's equally divided, similar to what we heard at Planning Commission. I do think that County Commission will look at it, and we could look into the details of it with the UDO, but there will be a discussion about the hillside ridgetop at County Commission.
Right. Well, so you mentioned the UDO, that's the Unified Development Ordinance. And so that is the next step, right? So if we get through, if County Commission approves this now in April, as you're saying, and I guess I should mention that County Commission, when they approved the growth policy amendment, they kind of held it in abeyance until they adopt a comprehensive land use plan so that they would both go into effect at the same time. So potentially by May, both of those things could be passed and adopted. So then we would have a new growth policy plan and map. We would have a new comprehensive plan and a future land use map. What happens next?
We are starting the process for the Unified Development Ordinance, which will look at all of our subdivision regulations, our zoning map, and update that to really, it is the next step to implement our comprehensive plan. So currently we will be in this transition phase, and you'll see, if you log on to the website, you'll see Appendix H, which will be how decision makers will make their zoning decisions as we're in this transition process. And it correlates place types with our current zones. The UDO will really look at just making our stormwater ordinance, subdivision regulations, and zoning all in one document.
Well,
right. Sorry, go ahead, Scott.
No, well, this process sounds very similar to the Recode Knoxville process that the city of Knoxville went through a couple of years ago. How will it be similar and how will it be different?
I was not a part of Recode Knoxville, so I can't really speak to that.
Okay.
But there will be a lot of public engagement similar to how Recode was. We will also have our stakeholder committee similar to how we had with Advance Knox throughout the comprehensive plan.
Right. And so, as you said, we're going to have this sort of interesting transitional period where we'll have a new plan, but we'll be working with our current zoning code. And so will the intention during that time be for Planning Commission and County Commission to, as much as possible, try to align any zoning or rezoning decisions they make with what's laid out in the plan, even before we get to an actual updated zoning ordinance?
Yes, that is the intention. And if you look at that, you'll see that there's a directly related, partially related, and I think there was one other box. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but that will help them make their zoning decisions. And it'll come out of a staff recommendation too from Planning Commission.
I mean, I noticed that County Commission is already kind of starting to do this, like in some of their zoning discussions last month, as they were looking at proposed rezonings, several of them were bringing in, well, in the new plan, which they haven't even adopted yet, but in the new plan, this area is going to be this. And I guess that's probably what you would prefer to see them do, because the concern that I could see from some people would be that somehow you're going to have people trying to use the old zoning to kind of get away with something that they won't be able to do in the new plan or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm, correct. Obviously, we would prefer that they adopt it first before they start using it. But there is this weird transition period that we're in right now.
So I guess as this all moves forward, where will people, the Advance Knox website has been a great repository of information throughout all of this. Is that going to continue to be the place for people to go and kind of see where we're at?
Yeah, on the website, you will see upcoming meetings. You will also see the interactive map. We have a draft revisions memo. So if we make any changes to the plan, changes that were provided or recommended by Planning Commission, and then if County Commission makes any changes, all of that will be on the Advance Knox website.
And that is advanceknox.org. All right. Anything else you want to add about all of this? Anything that people need to know?
I think that it is important to understand that this process doesn't rezone your property. We're not making you give your property away. We're not taking it away from you. This is just a way to help us better plan on how we want to grow.
And I guess also, and this came up with the Recode Knoxville process too, but even if, and I don't know that this will happen to much of anybody in the county plan, but even if like the overall plan for an area changed in a way that might make an existing use non-compliant, those existing uses are always going to be grandfathered in, right?
Correct. We put that in the growth policy amendment, actually. That is one thing that some constituents asked for.
Right. So any rights you have now, you're not going to lose.
Are not taken away. Correct.
Gotcha. All right. Well, Mandi, thanks very much for the update. We appreciate it. And again, anybody who's looking for information can go to advanceknox.org and maybe we'll check back in with you when we get to the Unified Development Ordinance process and how all that's going to go.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. All right, and thanks again to Mandi for joining us. Looking ahead to the coming week, we have a couple of things on the schedule. County Commission will hold its monthly work session on Monday. One thing to note there, as Mandi just informed us, is that although on the agenda they do have the comprehensive land use plan for consideration, they are going to defer that to April because they are going to have a separate workshop on that this coming Thursday in the main assembly room of the City County building at 2 p.m., and that will be the opportunity for county commissioners to, really kind of start to get a handle on what's in that plan, and probably also there will be discussion of that Hillside Ridgetop plan, as we were just talking about with Mandi. So both of those meetings. Apart from that, on Commission's Monday work session schedule, not a whole lot that looks really controversial, but we'll see if anything. Sometimes things can surprise you by jumping out off the agenda. And then Scott City Council is meeting on Tuesday.
They are, as we mentioned before, they're going to be considering this payment in lieu of tax agreement for Shot Club Social. They're going to be closing those final vote on closing those streets. But actually, kind of the big thing that's probably going to take a lot of attention is Councilwoman Amelia Parker has come back with a separate resolution on the situation in Gaza. In November, she had proposed a resolution that would encourage a ceasefire. It was the packed house. Palestinian Americans, the Jewish community, a lot of yelling, it was a pretty raucous meeting. It did not even come to a vote. She did not get a second for that proposal. She's come back with this one. This one's a little different. It refers to an International Court of Justice opinion that said it's one of those things that's kind of couched a little diplomatically that genocide could be going on in Gaza, and
right. It basically asked Israel not to commit genocide, but stop short of saying that Israel is committing genocide.
That's a succinct way of putting it. Yes, and then this resolution is one that basically says the city council would want our federal legislators, both our senators and Representative Tim Burchett, to kind of hold Israel's feet to the fire to make sure that the United States abides by this. One of the things that it talks about is aiding Israel, and of course that would mean cutting aid to Israel, and it also asks for a ceasefire. They don't use the term ceasefire, but in this resolution, but that's what it says. Anyway, it is going to come up for consideration. Don't know if it will meet the same fate as her last one. She did not get a second on the last one, so they didn't even discuss it. Nobody, and so there was no, even discussion about why. Should we even be doing this on the part of council members? So, but if it is anything like the meeting in November, there will be a lot of people very passionate on both sides, and a lot of discussion, at least from people there, from people in the general public. It might not get discussed among council members, but it will be discussed by people who show up for public forum.
Right, could be kind of a late night for you there.
Yep, it probably will be.
And then on Wednesday, both of our mayors, Mayor Kincannon in the city and Mayor Jacobs in the county, have a sort of unusual meeting that they're convening on homelessness, right? Yeah,
they're basically having a summit on homelessness in the Foundry. It's in the morning on Wednesday morning, so we'll get a nice long night at City Council and an early morning at the Foundry. But they're going to. It's a community part of a community wide discussion on homelessness. They're bringing in Julia Orlando, who is a consultant to communities on dealing with homelessness. She out of New Jersey. She'll be there. She's going to give the keynote address. And then they're also going to have a roundtable discussion that will include, developers of affordable housing. And so have a roundtable discussion there. It'll be, last a good chunk of the day, not the whole day, but they'll be discussing that as they develop new strategies to address housing and homelessness.
Mm-hmm. Should be interesting. And I wanted to make a quick correction. I had said that commission workshop on the comprehensive land use plan is Thursday at 2 p.m. in the main assembly room. It's actually Thursday at 2 p.m. in the small assembly room. Hopefully, if you showed up there and didn't see it in the main assembly room, you'd find it in the small assembly room.
Well, they're side by side.
Right next door. Yeah. But just want to be clear about that. And I also wanted to make one correction from last week's podcast when we were talking about the law director's race, and I was making the grave mistake of talking off the top of my head. And I said that David Book, the incumbent law director, had won with more than 2/3 of the vote in the primary over Daniel Herrera. Actually, he won by 61 to 39% margin. So still a decisive victory, still by more than 20 points. It was actually almost identical to in 2020 in the primary. He ran against former circuit court clerk Kathy Quist, and he won 60% of the vote there. So just wanted to make that note. It was still a decisive victory, but not quite at the blowout level that we made it sound last week. Apologies for the error. Thanks, as always, to Lord Seth Barber for his production work. Our theme music is by Will Wright, and we will be back here next week to talk about all of those things. And also, next week, when we record this, we are going to be in the midst of Big Ears, that wonderful music festival that is, in fact, coming up, and we may even talk about that a little bit next week.
We could talk about that.
All right. Talk to you later.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.